the block.
Okay, so I smoked Salvia divinorum a few times, and I'm going to recount one of the experiences that I had with it. I think every time I smoked it, it was completely different and extremely bizarre and weird. But this is what happened one time. One time I smoked some Salvia and immediately forgot who I was and what I was doing. And I found myself in the room with my friend, and in front of me there was this very strange sort of like train track that was like a conveyor belt that was traveling directly in front of me and going up the wall in front of me, then going backwards across the ceiling, then coming back around across the wall behind me, and then going around in front of me. And as this conveyor belt was going around in loops, I could feel myself being pulled along and like stretched, like from like all the way from one end of the room to the other end of the room. I was being stretched. And I heard my friend who was in the room with me say, "Oh, don't worry, everything's going to be okay." And I was like, "What, are you crazy? Everything's going to be okay. Can't you see I'm getting pulled apart by this giant conveyor belt thing?" And like, it was so fucking crazy. And like, but like within 5 minutes, I was like back to normal reality and back to myself and like wondering what happened. But anyway, that was one of my experiences with Salvia, and I'll be back very soon to tell you more. Thank you.
On the Block with Andrew Gurvich, a podcast about authentic people doing beautiful things. Enjoy the show.
How's it going, folks? Welcome to the program this week. This is your host, Andy Gurvich. Before we get to the guest and a little bit about what the topic is this week, I just want to mention a couple of things about the program itself. As I say regularly, we had the vision to make this show about creativity and transformation, put it out into the world to give folks some interaction with people out there that are using their skills, using their passion to try to transform their lives and the world into a more beautiful and equitable place. And we wanted the show to be free and accessible to anybody who had the ability and the interest to check it out. And we continue with that goal in mind. Having said that, it cost a good deal of money to make the show. Myself and producer Mike spent a lot of time and a lot of our own resources and our own money making the show, producing the show, hosting the show, and getting it delivered to you each week. So if you're a person with means and interest and the show has been valuable to you, consider please putting us as a part of your giving cycle at the end of the year here. If you're not a person of means, or if you like the show but don't want to contribute to it, please keep listening because we're glad you're on board, and by no means is financial participation a requisite for you to be a part of our community here at On the Block Radio. Having said that, we'd like to keep the lights on as we go into our middle part of our second year here with some amazing guests that we have coming up for you. More on this week's guest in a minute. Excuse me. The other thing I'd like to mention is that we've hit a bit of a plateau in terms of listening audience. The show is doing well worldwide. We're in some 50 countries now. We have several thousand listeners abroad, especially in Canada and in the UK. But we've hit a plateau here in the States and abroad in terms of our listening audience. And so if you're a person who is interested in the show and who listens regularly, maybe you could do us a favor and share the show with some friends on social media. Maybe try to introduce some people at work or in your circle of influence to the program and try to bring them on board with this conversation of creating a world that is safe and filled with opportunity and accessibility for all. Even before any of this Trump craziness started, I had the vision that it was important to make a program that reminded us that there are people out there that are set on accessing and enhancing and nurturing and cultivating the beauty and the truth that exists within each of us. And we continue with that goal, and are glad you are with us as a part of that conversation. So if you're able to, go onto our website, check out the PayPal donation button, and maybe send a few bucks our way. And if you are not interested in that, we're glad you're aboard anyway, and you're a full-fledged member of our community regardless. If you have the inclination and the ability, maybe share the show in the coming weeks with some folks that you think might benefit from joining our community. All right, this week's guest, David J. Brown, holds a master's degree in psychobiology and a BA in psychology from University of Southern California. He's an author, an interviewer, and one of the world's leading experts in this field of being a psychonaut. I've been aware of David's work for a while, his participation in Terence McKenna's The Archaic Revival. He has a wonderful book out called The New Science of Psychedelics, and some others, both science fiction novels and then volumes of interviews with leading edge scientists and folks who study the mind. In particular, the use of psychoactive plants and psychoactive substances on the development and expansion of consciousness. You know, I'll say this about the psychonaut scene, guys like David and folks that participate in it. When we started this show, dealing with folks that were in this world, that were in the sort of transformative scene, the festival circuit, folks that studied and used psychedelics as a way to expand consciousness. Many of you realize that I started out in podcasting as the co-host for Dr. Chris Ryan's Tangentially Speaking, and this is an area that Chris has spent a lot of time researching and bringing guests on. Chris, as a part of Joe Rogan's podcast, Duncan Trussell. There's a lot of folks out there that are covering this ground, and they have Dennis McKenna on a regular basis, and they have all of the folks from that, Graham Hancock, Sheldrake, all the people that are sort of luminaries, Russell Brand, how's that for a list of people, in that scene, who go to these festivals, who take these substances, and who, really are the sort of experts, if you will, in, Rick Doblin and a lot of these folks from MAPS. My interest in this is particular to a couple of areas. I'm interested in the use of psychedelic plants in healing capacities, anywhere from people for reconciling people to their own death, people with terminal illnesses, to helping heal PTSD in veterans and abuse survivors, helping people with cancer become reconciled to their own treatment and their own mortality. And I'm interested in them in their use through the years in a religious capacity. That's why we had Paul Devereaux on, who's often overlooked in this conversation, who wrote a great book, The Long Trip, about the prehistory of psychedelia and the use of psychedelic plants in hunter-gatherer and Paleolithic societies. So I have great interest in this area in two particular facets, but On the Block Radio, as it's developed, has developed not really as a show that I see as one of the forerunners in these conversations. I think there's already a lot of great stuff going on out there, like I said, on Chris Ryan's show, on Joe Rogan's show, on Duncan Trussell's show. So when folks like David come on the program, we really are fortunate that they're taking some time to come speak with us. And I think we have an interesting conversation here, because I think we're able to focus on those aspects I just mentioned, on those aspects of psychedelic plants and their use that does overlap with what we're doing here on this show. But I highly recommend you checking out David's work directly, and checking out if you're really interested in this topic, if you're somebody who participates in or studies the use of psychoactives in human consciousness, I challenge you to avail yourself to all of the other wonderful work that's being done out there. We hit on it when we can. It dovetails with the work we're doing here at OTB, but it's not a primary focus of our show. Having said that, I really am glad to be a part of this conversation, because I think a lot of folks in the transformative scene are very good at talking about certain aspects of this technology, and maybe not so much others. And so I do think we bring something special to the conversation. David is a wonderful guy, a very interesting man, and a brilliant dude, and somebody who for decades well before the podcasting thing took off, has seen the value in interviewing people that are luminaries in the transformative scene and getting their the record down of a conversation as a kind of archivist. And so in so many ways, both in print and in audio, David is a guy that has led the way in this field as well, this field of podcasting, in terms of specifically sitting down with people who are cultural icons, who maybe occupy different spaces in terms of their relationship to mainstream culture, but nonetheless have had a profound impact through their life and work on the human family, on the human project. And so great thanks to David for being an innovator in that field. And please do check out his extensive collection of interviews over the decades with people from that scene. All right, folks, On the Block Radio, David J. Brown coming up. I'll mention one more thing. I had a little shamanic experience of my own during the taping of this episode. I was feeling very odd as we were recording this episode, and there were some audio issues. I think a part of our second segment didn't get recorded, so there might be a couple of bumpy spots in terms of the audio capture as we're going through the episode. That evening, and normally don't share things like this on the air, that evening after my conversation with David, I went to sleep and actually had a very odd kind of seizure in my sleep that night, and have had to go to the doctor, and I've had to get some tests and stuff. And so I was in a kind of weird shamanic, non-drug induced altered state of consciousness for most of this interview, and had some odd things happen at the end of it. So if I seem a little odd and detached in this interview, it's not because I'm trying to get in character and act like I'm on mushrooms or something. It was because I was actually in the middle of a sort of a non-drug induced altered state of consciousness. So that should be interesting. All right, David J. Brown coming to you on the Block Radio, folks. Please do, like I said, get over to our site and donate and or share the program with some folks that you think might benefit from it. Coming up to the end of the year, got some fantastic guests coming up to close the year and then going into next year. I really do think you're going to be blown away at the shows we have, including this one coming up to close our year out. All right, we love you, folks. Stay with us on the Block Radio. Your host, Andy Gurbich, and we will see you on the other side.
If you ever get close to a human and human behavior, be ready to get confused. And me and my head after, there's definitely no logic to human behavior.
Dimethyltryptamine, commonly known as DMT, has received a lot of attention in recent decades on its own and as a result of discussions about ayahuasca, which has become a trendy, albeit illegal, drug. Whether it's from individuals like Terence McKenna, Joe Rogan, and Graham Hancock, or books and movies like DMT the Spirit Molecule, an incredible number of people have heard about DMT in a positive light.
Right. I mean, what about everyone just having kind of a collective DMT kind of release in their brain and having these alien encounters? I mean, I don't know. I don't know, because it is weird how everyone kind of has the same contact.
It's music to my ears. The very idea that there might be some way of inhaling some intoxicant that takes you to another dimension using DMT, which is dimethyltryptamine. I can't say it. It's a very, very long word. But something that's produced naturally in the pituitary gland, apparently, in the old noggin, and takes you to another dimension of consciousness.
DMT, the spirit molecule, you know, it's a conundrum, it's a paradox.
It's amazing that we have a molecule in our brain and throughout our body that is the most potent hallucinogen that we know.
Why is DMT in our bodies? Why is it in plants, in all sorts of mammals? And what is the role it plays in humans?
Between the inhalation and the exhalation, they were then transported into, whatever it is or wherever it is that DMT leads people.
It facilitates the entering and exiting of the soul in the body.
One casualty of the mass discussion about DMT has been the scientific burden of proof. Because of how profound the DMT experience can be, a lot of people have jumped the gun in attaching roles to the chemical. As such, I feel it's useful to take a look at some of the myths and facts about DMT. Before jumping into the myths, let me first make it clear what I mean by myth. For the purpose of this video, a myth is simply a belief that's not rooted in fact. Myth number 1. DMT is a spirit drug, meaning it's responsible for natural spiritual experiences or is actually a gateway to another realm of existence. This is a common held belief that's often represented as true, which isn't surprising given it's often called the spirit molecule. If you're basing your beliefs on evidence, however, it's currently not worth believing DMT is a spirit drug. That role for the substance has yet to be proven, and the burden of proof is particularly high if someone is claiming it's a doorway to another plane of existence. Maybe we will one day find that's true, but for now, it's not a supported belief. Myth number 2. DMT is released at death and is responsible for near-death experiences. Even though some individuals have found similarities between NDE reports and DMT experiences, there's nothing to back up this belief. If someone does have a hallucinatory near-death experience, it seems more likely, based on the limited research we have, that multiple factors play a role rather than a single drug like DMT. And, again, even if DMT is responsible, it's far too early to make that claim. Myth number 3. DMT is responsible for dreaming. Of the 3 myths, this seems to be the one people most often assert as fact, but, yet again, there's no evidence in this area. An accompanying myth is that DMT is released by the pineal gland, something which has not been proven. No psychological, much less spiritual role has been proven for DMT, though there is interesting research taking place that's beginning to identify potential physiological and psychological actions of endogenous DMT. While some of the popular beliefs about DMT aren't rooted in evidence, DMT is still a remarkably intriguing substance. So, let's look at some of the things that make it fascinating. Fact number 1. DMT is found naturally in the human body, and it may have various roles. While the idea that it's produced by the brain isn't supported by much, DMT seems to at least be produced elsewhere and actively transported into the brain. Through transport into the brain, peripherally produced DMT could still exert effects on the central nervous system. What those effects may be is less clear, but some evidence suggests DMT is taken up by the serotonin transporter and then stored in neuronal vesicles following its uptake by another transporter. If DMT accumulates in that way, it is hypothesized large amounts could be released at certain times, such as to protect the brain from damage when an oxygen deficiency occurs. When DMT is present at smaller concentrations, it may exert other effects. Fact number 2. People have been taking DMT for centuries. Whether it's in the form of snuffs or ayahuasca, DMT has been used for quite a while, and it has a particularly rich history in South America. Ayahuasca, a drink usually made from Psychotria viridis, which contains DMT, and Banisteriopsis caapi, which contains MAOIs, has a history stretching back centuries. And there's evidence of snuffs like Yopo, which is made from Anadenanthera peregrina, being used even further back. Yopo also contains 5-hydroxy-DMT, another psychedelic. Fact number 3. DMT is present in many plants and animals. DMT can be found in relatively high concentrations in hundreds of organisms. And with its simple synthesis from tryptophan, it's likely to appear in a significant number of plants and animals that simply haven't been looked at yet. However, the high prevalence of DMT should not be taken as evidence of a supernatural role of the drug. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comment section. Support on Patreon is greatly appreciated, so if you'd like to contribute, you can head to patreon.com/thedrugclassroom. You can also contribute through YouTube, PayPal, or Bitcoin using the addresses and links in the description. You can connect with me on Twitter at Seth A. Fitzgerald and via email at seth@thedrugclassroom.com.
You've been listening to On the Block, a podcast for bonobos only. No chimps allowed.
Folks, this is your host, Andy Gurvich. Our guest this week is David J. Brown. David holds a master's degree in psychobiology. I can't wait to ask him about that, from New York University, and a BA in psychology from the University of Southern California. He's the author of 2 science fiction novels, Brainchild and Virus, and is the co-author of 2 volumes of interviews with leading-edge scientists and artists, Mavericks of the Mind and Voices from the Edge, which, besides being in English, have been translated into Japanese, Italian, and Czechoslovakian. David has written for Wired, Discover, and Scientific American, and has made numerous contributions to several books, including having co-written a chapter in Terence McKenna's The Archaic Revival. He is also the author of The New Science of Psychedelics at the Nexus of Culture, Consciousness, and Spirituality. David, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Andy. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for that wonderful introduction.
You know, I've been following your work for a while, and you are, a tried and true psychonaut. I am so excited to talk to you.
I'll see what I can do.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you, before we get into all that, I want to ask you about your early work. And so what is psychobiology?
Psychobiology is a term that's not really used that much anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Now they use the term behavioral neuroscience or physiological psychology or biological psychology. It's basically the interface between psychology and biology. So it looks at neural mechanisms of behavior in the mind and where neuroscience and psychology come together.
That's really fascinating. And what was your area of focus when you were first doing this work?
My primary area of focus when I was at New York University, I was looking at electrical brain stimulation to a particular area called the lateral hypothalamus, which is an area that's associated with hunger and food satiety. And we would hook up rats to these little brain stimulators, insert electrodes into the lateral hypothalamus, and give them the option to press a little bar that would deliver electric current into that area. And they often found the electric current so pleasurable and so stimulating that they would sit there and they would repeatedly press this little bar over and over and over again for stimulation, to the point of avoiding food, avoiding mates, and doing it to the point of dropping to exhaustion, and then starting almost immediately the moment that they woke up. So that was an interesting model for drug addiction or for different types of addictive behavior.
And what did you draw from that in terms of parallels for human behavior? What was the conclusions you came to from that research?
Well, I'll tell you the most interesting conclusion that I drew from it was this research was started by none other than John C. Lilly. He was the person who began the first electrical brain stimulation research.
Yes.
Who also became a close friend of mine years later. He's also the same person who started human-dolphin communication research, and he's also the person who developed the isolation tank, or the flotation or sensory deprivation tank. What was most interesting, I thought, I spent a lot of time, first in the lab watching these rats repeatedly press a bar for electrical stimulation. And I don't know how much you know about John Lilly, but he had quite a fondness for a psychedelic anesthetic called ketamine.
Yeah.
And he used it quite frequently. And there were periods in his life where I watched him use ketamine the same way that I saw the rats press that bar for electrical stimulation over and over again. And I could not help remarking how ironic it was to see, the person who began this research acting in a very, very, very similar way. But let me also say that John was incredibly brilliant, did amazing work, amazing research. He was a very wonderful human being, and I love him dearly. But anyone who knows him knows that he did have an addiction to ketamine and used it in a way that was uncannily similar to the way that the rats used electrical brain stimulation.
Were you able to make that observation to him directly ever?
I don't think I ever did. I'm trying to recall if I ever actually brought that up in conversation, but I don't think I ever did.
Did you ever, or since, have you been interested in folks that are looking back at the hemispheres of the brain and how they affect consciousness? I know for a while in like the late 60s, there was this idea that the left hemisphere dealt with rationality and the right dealt with emotions, and we gendered them and said the left hemisphere was more masculine and the right more feminine, and all of that has been kind of set aside. We know that both hemispheres deal with language, both deal with emotion, both deal with rationality, but there is still a difference in how they both help us perceive the world. And there's been like Jill Bolte Taylor and Ian McGilchrist and others have done some really amazing work in looking at the perceptual differences in the hemispheres, and how Jill looks at even how her great, I'm sure you're aware of her work, realization that came from her stroke is that hemispheric science is allowing her to see the world through this kind of Buddhist lens, which I know your work, especially with Robert Anton Wilson, brought you to the same place. And so I wonder if you've seen the parallels there.
I see any parallels between.
I guess what I'm saying is those that are looking at hemispheric science now and how that affects brain activity, especially our sense of peace and our sense of self, and your work in Zen Buddhism.
For this for a while, the difference between the hemispheres. This was based originally upon research that was done by Nobel Prize winner Roger Sperry and his student Michael Gazzaniga.
Okay.
What they did initially, I guess this was back in the early '60s, was people who suffered from very severe epilepsy, where seizures would start in one part of the brain and eventually run to the whole brain. They discovered that if they would sever what's called the corpus callosum, which is this big bundle of connecting fibers between the right and the left hemisphere of the brain, that if they severed that the person actually suffered very few side effects from doing that, and it's helped to stop the spread of the seizure through the entire brain. So this was something that was kind of routinely done with people who had very severe epilepsy that couldn't be treated in any other way.
Wow.
And when this was the first operation and surgeries were done, they didn't notice any changes in the person right away, but the changes later became quite apparent. And they noticed that the two parts of the brain almost seemed to be functioning as independent people. I mean, I saw really uncanny videos when I was in school of, people who had these split brain operations, and you would see them trying to get dressed, and one side of their, one hand would be trying to pull up their pants, the other hand trying to pull them down. And
wow.
And so they recognized that these two parts of the brain were functioning somewhat independently in people that had the split brain operation, and this gave a great opportunity to actually study how they function independently. And they did some really remarkable research. Now, what they learned to do was to be able to project an image to just one side of the brain at a time. Now, most people know that the right side of the body is controlled by the left side of the brain,
right,
and the left side of the body is controlled by the right side of the brain. The same thing goes for your visual field. Your visual field can be divided into two areas, right and left. If you project a visual image onto one area of the eye, the right or the left, it will go to the opposite side of the brain. And if there's no corpus callosum connecting the two brain hemispheres, then this will be only seen by that part of the brain. Now, this is the really interesting research that he did. He ran these experiments, and he would flash an image to either the right or the left hemisphere of the brain, and then ask the person, what did you just see? And whenever the image was flashed to the left hemisphere of the brain, where most people's language centers are, the person could easily say what it was. Oh, a car, or I saw a boat, or I saw an ice cream cone, or whatever it was. And if they would flash the image to the left side of the brain, to the right side of the brain, where most people don't have their speech centers, people would say, I didn't see anything.
Oh, wow.
But get this. Then they would say, okay, could you pick out of the pile in front of you what you just saw? Then, with their left hand, which was controlled by the right side of the brain, they would easily and always pick out the right object.
Wow.
Okay? Now, even more bizarre, they would ask the person, so I thought you said you didn't see the image. Why did you pick that object? And the left hemisphere of the brain, the speech center, would make something up. Oh, that reminded me of a toy from my childhood, or it just looked kind of interesting, or for some reason that really had nothing to do with the actual reality of why they picked it, because the right side of the brain actually knew, and it used the left hand to pick it out.
Wow.
So that was the beginning of this research, to show that there actually are specialized areas that there really seems to be that left brain seems to handle a little more logic, and the right brain seems to be more with in speech, and the right brain seems to be a little more visual, spatial. But there was suddenly this whole slew of pop psychology books that exaggerated it and added details that weren't really true, and it got sort of blown out of proportion. And I think that's what you were getting at.
Yeah.
But there is something to it nonetheless, and even greater than that is not that just the right and the left hemisphere operate somewhat independently, but you have modules throughout your entire brain that seem to operate somewhat independently. And Michael Gazzaniga, John Sperry's student, went on to study this much further, and there's been quite a bit written about it. But it's truly fascinating, and it really challenges the idea that we're the unified self that we think we are most of the time.
You've done a lot of work with the pineal gland as well, right? I mean, this is another area.
I've done a lot of work with
the pineal gland as well. Is this another area that is a specific portal for?
Well, I haven't really done any particular biopsychology research with that. It's more something that I've just been interested in on a more
interested in a while.
That I've experimented with, probably psychedelics that activated my pineal gland.
What was so let's ask you about that. So you're going along in this program, and can you let our listeners know? I mean, you've spoken about this before and written about it, but this call to action, in the Campbellian sense, your call to the underworld, your Odysseus moment, your call to transformation. You write about in your book about awakening from your slumber and recognizing this pre-programmed robotic nature, I believe I remember you calling it. So how did that happen? What brought that about, and what facilitated that change?
I think that I went through my primary spiritual awakening when I was a teenager at the age of 16, when I first tried LSD. I think that was the thing that really opened me up to higher states of consciousness. I think that everyone has these brain centers inside of them that are just waiting to be activated by the right chemical or the right stimulus of some sort. Within 2 days of having that spiritual awakening experience with LSD, I had my first lucid dream. A lucid dream being an experience where one becomes awake and aware in the dream and while it's actually happening. And those two things, that the lucid dream and that psychedelic experience, were the two primary things that opened me up. And I spent a lifetime exploring that connection. And that's the subject of my newest book, Dreaming Wide Awake, looking at exactly that direct connection between the psychedelic experience and dreaming.
I was going to get into that later, actually, but since you brought it up, let's talk about it now. I believe in talking about things as they arise, and so I didn't know that. So what was it? Do you remember the particular things about that LSD experience that made it so spiritual for you? Like what did you see? What did you experience?
What made it so spiritual for me? It was actually, for the first 3 or 4 hours, it was a very frightening experience. The very first time that I did it, I didn't feel anything for the first couple hours. I was with a friend, and I had actually told the friend to go home because I didn't think anything was going to go on that night. And went to bed, turned out the lights, and started seeing strange visions when I closed my eyes, and at that point I started to become scared that I was going to forget who I was. That was the fear tactic that I was told when I was in school, was that if you do LSD, you're going to forget who you are. So I started thinking, oh my God. And I started repeating, my name is David J. Brown, and I started repeating my address. Repeating my name, my address, over and over and over again, kind of like a mantra, over and over and over again. And realizing in retrospect now how ridiculous that was, I was desperately trying to hold on to my ego, which was just dissolving all over the place. And those first couple of hours were difficult. And at one point, I decided, what can I do to help change this? I'd heard people putting on music makes a difference. So I put on an album by the Electric Light Orchestra.
Nice.
And almost within seconds, it turned the experience around, and it suddenly became like just pure ecstasy and pure bliss.
Wow.
And then I went outside. This must have been around 5 or 6 in the morning, and I lied out and watched the sun come up. And that was one of the most spiritual experiences of my life. I just stared at the sunrise, and I felt like every spiritual, philosophical question about the nature of the universe, where do we come from, what does it all mean, what happens after you die, what is God, all those questions were just answered to me as I was thinking them. The answers just came as I was thinking them.
No kidding.
And that experience was one of the most powerful, and I was never the same after that again. And that's one of the things that really helped to start my career as a writer and to further the research that I do. And everything really came out of that one particular morning when I had that really powerful mystical awakening.
You were 16.
Yep.
And then you had a lucid dream after that, right? And I want to ask you about the nature of that and about lucid dreaming, but one of the things that comes up right away to me is a question about method. And this was the classic, my reading at least of the problem Castaneda faces when he's first trying to study with his shaman in the first couple of books of that series. And that's, he's trying to learn the things the shaman has to teach him, Don Juan has to teach him through a purely sort of rationalistic approach. Like, teach me these things, I'll write them down in my book, and then I'll understand them. And Don Juan says there are some things you can't know unless you experience them directly. And that actually, I belong to a group called the Society for the Anthropology of Consciousness, and it's a group of anthropologists that are a subset of the American Association of Anthropologists. I'm on their board, and the group is actually founded as a response to Castaneda's challenge, which was a real challenge for academia. It's a real challenge for epistemology, which is, are there things that can't be known unless they're experienced directly? And some of us might move past that and say, well, of course, but that's a real challenge for the scientific method, is it not? I mean, that's a huge thing. You just said that experience became the basis for your work and your research, and that's a relatively controversial statement, because there would be many that in the scientific study in fields that would say that no personal experiences should influence the data set, and we should keep our experiences separate from the data. And you seem to be coming from a more holistic standpoint, that saying,
but is that even really possible? Is it really possible to really be purely objective? I mean,
go ahead. Well, go ahead, speak to that.
I'm sorry?
Go ahead, speak to that question. Is it possible?
Well, I just really wonder if that's even possible. I mean, I don't think it is. I think it's something we sort of strive towards to become more and more objective. Science is based on the whole idea that we can develop an objective view of the world that is aside from a personal bias. But you're always going to be seeing the universe through a nervous system that was designed by a specific genetic code that narrows down the spectrum of what you see. I mean, you only see this narrow band of the visible light spectrum. You only, you're conditioned by your childhood, by cultural programming, to only, see and hear certain aspects of your environment.
Right.
I mean, there's a million reasons why what you're experiencing is only a very, very, very limited amount of what's real. So, I first of all, the limitation on what we can experience, I think, is putting a bias. I mean, how would we get a perspective of the universe that wasn't biased by what it's like to see things through a mammalian nervous system?
Well, that's really true. We just had Bruce Damer on the show, and I'm fascinated by his ability. He talked about this, about going into these, and in his case, he talks about these non-drug-induced liminal states, but that wasn't a big deal for him, that if they are or are not drug-induced. It was just in his particular case.
I'm having a little trouble hearing you.
Okay, how about now? Is that better?
Yeah.
I said we had Bruce Damer on the show, and we were talking about how he goes into these non-drug-induced liminal states and uses those as the basis for his, as sort of to trigger his intuition and creativity, and that becomes the basis for his research. And he talked about how common that was, throughout the ages in scientific discovery, that actually happened a lot. Including we talked about Crick and Watson.
I talked to Bruce about that. Bruce is a friend, and I actually have in my new book, Dreaming Wide Awake, I actually have 2 pages about an experience that he had doing his endogenous lucid dreaming, or whatever he calls it, as a way of helping to develop engineering projects. It is remarkable. He actually approached me about a month ago and asked me if I wanted to co-author a book with him on the subject.
Oh, wow.
Which I'm considering doing. It is. He has abilities that I don't know any other human being has, but he is able to go into like a lucid dream state at will, or almost like a mini ayahuasca state. It's remarkable. He spoke to you about this?
Yes, he did at length. Yeah, absolutely. He's our guest next week, actually.
Yeah.
Which isn't going to make any sense because your episode's going to air well after his, but listeners will figure it out.
He's really brilliant. Very, very brilliant.
Oh, he's fantastic.
Yeah.
So, a question I had for you. So, you were in the. Where were you living when you were a teenager?
I was living in Somerville, New Jersey.
Okay, so you were in the East Coast, and then after all of this is when you head out west. Is that correct?
Yeah, I headed out west around the age of 19 or 20. I transferred to the University of Southern California in Los Angeles.
But your head had already been cracked open to this, elevated consciousness and these shamanic states and all of that, because you had already had this dream and this LSD experience.
Yeah, it was cracked open in the sense that, at 16 I had the initial psychedelic experiences, and then I started reading books by people like Robert Anton Wilson and John Lilly and Timothy Leary and Terence McKenna, that whole thing. And I got really involved in that, but it wasn't until I had come to California and had gone to a workshop at the Esalen Institute in Big Sur that I finally really met the psychedelic community. And that was how I became connected with all the people that I work with today and that I have interviewed in my books and things like that.
I heard Terence talk once at one of those talks, I think at Esalen, when he said he was talking about the significance of California and of coming as far west as you could go in Manifest Destiny and sort of coming to the edge of the Pacific and realizing that you can't go any further west, and then the impulse was to then turn inward and begin the journey inward. And he thought that that's
a really interesting. It's funny. I had never I haven't never heard Terence say that, and I would have loved to have actually talked to him about that, because Timothy Leary told me a similar idea that I've really thought about quite a bit. It's part of the reason that I do live in California. He pointed out that human migration for the past couple thousand years has been moving in a steadily westward direction.
Oh, wow.
That the very first civilizations are in the East. India and China are the oldest civilizations on the planet. And you can see as a culture, as a civilization goes through its period where it's most creative, where it's most experimental with new lifestyles, new sciences, new technologies, and all sorts of things, that group has continuously moved in a westward manner for several thousand years, from India and China through the Middle East, through Eastern Europe, Western Europe, to England, to East Coast of the United States, all the way to California and Hawaii. He pointed out why was it that California was settled by Western Europeans and not the Chinese and the Asians. And it's because there's been this Western migration movement, and the reason for that is because of evolution. It's been going on longer than human migration.
Right.
It's been going on since the beginning, since the first fish crawled out of the water onto dry land, try to get up onto its hind legs, try to get up into the trees, try to fly. There was a constant movement upward, constant trying to get high, basically.
Right. Wow.
Literally high. And when you look at the planet Earth spinning from an extraterrestrial vantage point, meaning off the planet looking down at it, you see that moving from east to west is actually a climb upwards. You're actually climbing up this giant mountain from India to California, basically. And I think that helps to explain why in California right now we have so much innovation, so much creativity, so much experimentation with lifestyles and things like that, because we're all the gene pools that, we're dissatisfied with, other areas and wanted something new and wanted to keep pushing the boundaries. And so we have this huge pool of people now. And yeah, I agree with Terence that part of it's to go inward, but I also see space migration, moving off the planet, as a very important next step in our evolutionary process.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point you make, because I had heard Terence make that point, and I've thought a lot about what that meant in terms of this turn inward. But I think you're right, because that turn inward, and we just were talking about it. I was just asking you all of this line of questioning in regard to you making that connection, and folks like Bruce as well. And, I've heard you write in other places about the importance of confronting mystery in the sciences, and that's true for consciousness and myth and art as well, that this thing you're talking about in innovation really comes after a sort of contemplation of the mystery and people being willing to step into these liminal spaces, even as developers, and into places they haven't been before, and sort of learning how to navigate that space. Would you say that's somewhat correct?
I'm having trouble hearing you. I'm so sorry.
No, that's fine.
You're breaking up, and I'm only getting half the words you're saying.
Okay. What I was saying is that I've heard you. Can you hear me better?
A little better. I still try to talk up as much as you can.
Okay. Yeah, I have the microphone right in my mouth. That's weird. I was saying that one of the things I really appreciate about your work is you talk about the importance of confronting mystery in the sciences. And when this question we just had about heading west, I think you bring up innovation, and I think that to innovate in any field, whether we're talking about in the sciences or in consciousness studies or in art, you have to be willing to step into these liminal spaces and in some sense be disoriented and learn how to navigate these very, very, very in-between spaces. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that it sort of takes a kind of well, certainly if you've been thinking in a very, habitual way, it takes a kind of momentary trip into chaos a little bit to mix things up and to get a more creative and unique and new perspective on things. So, yeah, I think that's absolutely essential. Am I getting it?
Yeah, absolutely. Ansaro Ali, who continues the work on the Eighth Circuit brain, he calls this the Chapel Perilous.
Right.
That kind of chaotic place.
That's the title of the new book about Robert Anton Wilson, by the way.
Oh, really?
Yeah, somebody's writing a biography right now of Robert Anton Wilson. That's the title of the book.
That's called Chapel Perilous. Wow.
Yep.
So you worked on Archaic Revival. Which chapter did you co-write?
Oh, yes. That was actually, I think, one of the first books I ever had published. There's a chapter in that book called The Critique Interview.
Okay.
And that interview that we did with Terence, that was the very first interview that we ever did. It came out it was in our book Mavericks of the Mind, and also in his book The Archaic Revival. Yeah, I was pretty thrilled at the time when it happened. I was just 26 years old, and I don't even think I knew that he was using it in the book until it was published.
That's amazing. So a quick question, a question about your books of interviews, and then we'll go to our first break. So you've done a couple of these now, and I'm just wondering, so, just to give folks an idea of the people you've interviewed, you've spoken with, like you said, Terence McKenna, John Lilly, Robert Anton Wilson, Timothy Leary. You spoke with, who am I forgetting? Dozens more.
George Carlin,
Abraham, George Carlin, Noam Chomsky, Ralph Abraham, Rian Eisler.
I'm doing my fifth book of interviews right now. Jack, I did the first couple of books were basically with psychedelic philosophers: Timothy Leary, John Lilly, Terence McKenna, Ralph Abraham,
Albert Hoffman,
Laura Huxley, Sasha Shulgin, that whole group, Stephen LaBerge. I interviewed almost every major person in the psychedelic community, and then years later, more cultural icons: Jerry Garcia, George Carlin,
yeah. We had Kelly on the show recently.
Then I did a whole series of books about one book about interviews with medical researchers, Andrew Weil and Jack Kevorkian, and people like that. And then my newest collection, the one I'm working on right now with my partner Rebecca Hale, is going to be a collection of interviews primarily with women visionary artists. And so far for that collection, we've interviewed Allison Gray and Amanda Sage and Martina Hoffman, and we'll be done with that book in about a year. So,
that's fantastic.
Yeah, I love to do interviews.
Well, okay, so I have a question. I mean, do you feel a sense of obligation to history? I mean, as a chronicler of so many of the figureheads of this movement, I mean, it's such an honor to have done these interviews, but after a while, you start looking at the catalog and realizing that, like, you've sort of either on purpose or inadvertently become a sort of Bill Moyers of the consciousness movement. You know what I mean?
Yeah, well, I did feel a sense of historical urgency and necessity for doing this. It really was. I felt that there was valuable information that was on the verge of being lost. Many of the people that I interviewed in my initial books were basically at the end of their lives, and I really wanted to talk to them before they left. And one of the most important things that I wanted to document in my interviews was the role that psychedelics have played in creative and cultural innovation over the past 30 or 40 years or so. And I was really afraid that this might be lost to history. I considered it extremely important. And in some of my interviews, I got people to open up really for the first time publicly about their use of psychedelics. For example, Deepak Chopra, the spiritual teacher. In my book, Conversation Against the Apocalypse, he talked about his LSD experiences when he was younger for the first time publicly. John Mack was another person. He was the late John Mack, who was a psychiatric researcher at Harvard who did all the work with alien abduction researcher. He also talked about his psychedelic experiences with me for the first time publicly. And another one was Candace Pert, the neuroscience researcher who discovered the opiate receptor in the brain. She also talked to me about her psychedelic experiences. And she's no longer alive, but she told me that she had to put a caveat at the end and say, I don't do these things anymore, of course, and I would never do them now. And I don't smoke marijuana anymore even, but apparently they were instrumental in helping her develop some of her ideas that helped to really further her research.
You've written about your relationship with Robert Anton Wilson, and I wonder, just last question before we go to break, and then we can pick some of this up on the other side. If you can talk about, I think you said, and correct me if I'm wrong, and if so, if not, expand on this, that it was here that you started really seeing the strong connection between world religions and mythology and psychedelics, is when you studied with Bob.
Did I really help to see the relationship between world religions and
psychedelics?
I think I started to see that before I started really started hanging out with Bob. Bob's book Cosmic Trigger at the age of 16 was really instrumental in changing my philosophy, and I didn't really meet him and start hanging out with him until I was 26.
Okay, so it was well before that. Okay,
and I think I had made that connection more when I was a teenager. And I actually started studying world religions in college because I grew up in a pretty atheist household, actually. My dad taught me about evolution, Darwinian evolution as a child, and I was having spiritual experiences with LSD and, looked into all the different world religions to try to understand it. People like Alan Watts and Ram Dass and other religious philosophers. But becoming friends with Robert Anton Wilson at the age of 26 and seeing him at least once a week from the age of 26 up until he died, I think in 2005 or something, was really had a remarkable influence on my life.
What is it about Buddhism in particular, or maybe if you can speak to some thoughts you might have on religion, like in particular? So in your study of the various world religious traditions, I'm a professor of world religions.
I think Buddhism, especially Tibetan Buddhism, is probably the most spiritually advanced system on the planet. I mean, in some ways, it's not even really a religion. It's more of a psychological system for advancing consciousness, but it's a very sophisticated system for understanding different states of consciousness and how to elevate different states of consciousness and how to work with them. It's really quite brilliant. I wish I studied it more and I knew more about it. I'm kind of ignorant, but I've taken some classes in it and I've read quite a bit. But really interests me the most is Tibetan Buddhism and its relationship with lucid dreaming, which I explore in my book. Lucid dreaming is utilized in Tibetan Buddhism as one of the paths towards enlightenment, and also as a preparation for death and for reincarnation. they believe that the dream state is very similar to what they call the bardos, or the after-death states, and that by learning how to become lucid and aware in our dream state, we learn how to then become lucid and aware in the post-death state in the bardos, so that we are able to more consciously incarnate in our next lifetime, if you believe that.
Have you changed your belief? You said you were raised in a pretty materialist household. I don't mean like money-wise. I just mean scientifically. Have you changed your belief on if consciousness survives the body after doing all of this work?
Yeah, well, I don't know if I've changed my belief. I've questioned my belief. I mean, I'm certainly not an atheist, and I'm very happy that my dad taught me about Darwinian evolution.
Sure, yeah, it's a good thing to know about. Yeah,
and when I got into the study of spiritual states of consciousness and the world religions, I think I approached it kind of like a scientist, and I never really bought into any particular religion, but my views did change. I pretty much, the way I define myself now is a term that I got from Robert Anton Wilson, which I really liked. Bob called himself a transcendental agnostic, which I really liked. An agnostic being someone who's not convinced one way or the other about whether there's some type of higher intelligence in the universe or designing intelligence in the universe, that you're open to the evidence, and you'll explore the evidence when you see it. But by saying transcendental before it, you also recognize that there are more elevated states of consciousness and other types of intelligences in the universe that probably have a significance in terms of understanding that. So I always like that definition a lot, a transcendental agnostic.
Transcendental agnostic, and that goes back to what we were saying a second ago about allowing this healthy presence of mystery in one system to avoid dogmatism and closed thinking. Well, let's go to break, and then when we come back, I have several more questions for you. I want to actually pick up with a few questions about prehistory and psychedelia and ask you if you know about Paul Devereaux's work, and talk a little bit about Paleolithic art, a little more about lucid dreaming, and then we'll let you go. Does that sound good?
I don't know much about Paleolithic art, to be honest. So.
Okay, well, I know a little bit about it. So, okay. We're talking to David J. Brown, folks. This is your host, Andy Gurvich. You're listening to On the Block Radio. We'll be right back after these words.
Thanks for listening to On the Block, a show that's broadcast from the crossroads of creativity and transformation. Stay tuned for more mind-bending conversation with our guests.
Okay, in 1989, I first tried a anesthetic drug called ketamine when I was in graduate school studying neuroscience at the University of Southern California. It was a very interesting experience. Ketamine was the drug that we used actually to anesthetize the animals prior to surgery. And we were doing research at the time with rabbits. And I was inserting what were called cold probes into an area of their brain called the cerebellar cortex, and then doing various experiments with them afterwards. But what I had heard and learned from reading John Lilly's books and from spending time with him, that ketamine was also a very powerful psychedelic. So, being the ever eager researcher, I brought some home with me one night and was eager to try it. So one night I worked up the courage and sat down on my bed, and I injected about 90 milligrams of pure liquid ketamine into my right thigh muscle. And then around 5 minutes later, I suddenly realized that all of my doctoral advisors at the university were actually extraterrestrial scientists, and that we weren't really studying the behavior of rabbits. We were really studying me, that they were actually extraterrestrial scientists that were on an experimental adventure to investigate my brain, and I was actually the experimental subject, I realized. And as I was realizing, quote unquote, this to a further and further degree, I saw myself suddenly in a giant cage surrounded by giant rabbits that were experimenting on me and doing things to my brain and inserting cold probes and electrodes, and there were wires hanging out from my head, and it was a very uncomfortable and frightening situation. And when I returned to my body, I was pretty confused about what was going on. But this much I'll have to say is that I didn't last that much longer in this behavioral neuroscience doctoral program, as I think that my mind was opened up to new possibilities too much, and I went off and began to study with my friend Dr. John Lilly.
Hi, I'm Douglas Rushkoff, author of Throwing Rocks at the Google Bus, and you're listening to On the Block Radio.
Which our brains vibrate at, and we just tune into it in some way. I mean, I know that DNA molecule actually emits a very, very low level of light, and that if you sit in a completely solid pitch black room with a camera aperture open for 3 or 4 hours, it will eventually photograph a picture of you made up entirely of the light just from your DNA.
Wow.
So yeah, there's definitely some energy being emitted, and it's pure speculation as to what it is. But I mean, when we do ayahuasca or mushrooms, it seems like we can tap into that energy in some kind of way.
That's really remarkable. I want to cycle back to a couple of things. I would be remiss in a conversation with you if I didn't ask you a couple of questions about, what some people see as some of the downside of this. And so, anything from, the MK Ultra experience, or the MK Ultra stuff. What am I trying to say? Not experiments and mind control from the government. There's folks out there when we try to talk about psychedelics and the transformation of consciousness. There's two things that always come up. And one is this sort of government CIA mind control thing, and then the other one is related to it, which is that it's bread and circuses, is that you send these kinds of things out to the transformative, to the festival community, and it just keeps them occupied. People go to Burning Man and dance around and do MDMA, but it doesn't ever translate back into real transformation of consciousness in people's lives. And I'm wondering if you can speak to those two criticisms.
Yeah, I could say a little bit about, first of all, let me speak a little bit about the actual genuine dangers of psychedelics, which you kind of alluded to at the beginning. In general, psychedelic drugs, of course, I'm just giving out purely for educational, informational purposes only, but psychedelic drugs are some of the safest from a physiological point of view. They don't elevate heart rate too much. They don't cause any vulnerabilities in the body that can make one sick, or they're pretty safe on a physical level. The dangers of psychedelics are really mostly psychological, and we really couldn't say that this was a powerful medicine for curing and helping people unless we acknowledge that it had the same power to hurt. I mean, a real medicine can both hurt and harm. So it's powerful stuff. It's very, very powerful. It opens people up to things they may not be ready to be opened up for. Somebody who's unstable, who doesn't have a lot of mental strength, or who has had a lot of previous trauma, may not be ready for the new stage of consciousness, for the memories that it can bring back, and it can be overwhelming. And there are some people who do have mental breakdowns as a result. There are some people who are mentally damaged as a result. When you look at actual, set and setting plays such an important role. The environment that people do it in, and the mental state that they're in prior to doing it. It's very important in terms of whether people have a positive, transformative experience. But there have been scientific studies that show that when people do it with a proper setting and a proper environment, with the proper mental state, that most people will have positive, transformative experiences. And even in the wrong environments, it seems that still the majority of people have positive experiences. And they've done psychological studies with just people who have done psychedelics when they were younger to see how mentally stable they are compared to the average population. And people who have done psychedelics tend to be more mentally balanced than people who haven't.
I've read a few articles recently that were even in places like the New Yorker that were citing work being done at NYU and a few other places. The MAPS folks are all over this as well, about some really promising research with vets with PTSD and also in end-of-life care, especially with psilocybin.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, they're wonderful. NYU, my old school, that's where I got my master's degree.
Yeah.
Wish I was doing electrical brain stimulation and with rats there. God, I wish I was doing psilocybin research.
I know, right?
It wasn't going on back in 1986, unfortunately.
Have you ever thought about venturing back into the halls of academia, or do you feel like you're kind of best served out here where you are?
Oh, right now I feel like I'm out of that world. Really, I'm really very happy being a science writer right now, and just writing and lecturing. This is really, I think I found my niche. So,
I mean, I think you have too.
Thank you.
I want to ask you a question. So you did some work that people, I'm sure a lot of people do know about this, but you helped conduct some research on Rupert Sheldrake's books, right, on morphogenetic fields.
Yes.
And I was just wondering if you could speak to a little bit about what that work was, and Rupert's work, and then what your work was in response to it.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I worked with Rupert Sheldrake. He's a British biologist, a very controversial British biologist, for 3 years, from 1995 to 1998. I did all the California-based research for 2 of his books, Dogs That Know When Their Owners Are Coming Home, and The Sense of Being Stared At, and I co-authored 3 scientific papers with him.
Wow.
So we did quite a bit of work. We looked at a couple different areas. The first area and the primary area that we studied was what we call the unexplained powers of animals. These were mysterious powers that animals supposedly had that had never really been scientifically studied. Rupert, I thought Rupert is a genius, absolute genius. And one of the really important insights that he brought to my attention was that, animals have been so carefully studied in the wild, and they've been so carefully studied in laboratories, but they've never been really studied in terms of their human relationships. We all have pets, we all develop relationships, but no one's really studied that connection.
Wow.
And one of the most significant and mysterious things that a lot of people claim is that they say that when they have a pet dog that they know really well and they're bonded with really closely, when a particular family member or one member of the household goes out, and before they return, maybe 15 minutes, 20 minutes before they return, the dog will wait in the same spot, by the window, by the door, wagging its tail, looking and waiting. And many people notice that this seemed to be happening before the animal was able to actually hear the car or get any kind of sensory information that should have been able to indicate that the person was coming home. So we took this seriously, and we actually did studies where we actually had we recruited people who reported that they had this phenomena with their dog, and we set up a video camera pointed at the place where the dog was reputed to wait, and then we had the person go out, and I would give them a beeper, and at a random time, in a period of 4 hours, I would beep them, and at the time that I would beep them, they were to then start their journey home. And then when they got home, I would meet them at home, and I would collect the videotape. And then I went through all these videotapes, and I coded how much time the animal spent in that particular spot that was reputed to be waiting in. And what we found was that with certain dogs, in certain cases, at a very significant level, the animal would wait in that spot much, much, much more frequently after I signaled the person to return home than before.
Wow.
So it seemed that there was some type of telepathic communication or some type of communication by a means that science just currently doesn't recognize. We do not understand what the variable was. But skeptics said, oh, it could have been the sound of the car. It could have been the smell of the person. It could have been, some people said the same time of the day, or things like that. So we controlled for all of those variables.
Right.
People came back, like I said, at random times. We had people come back in... going against the way the wind was blowing, so they couldn't be, the olfactory stimuli was filtered out. We had people come home in taxis. We had people come home in wheelchairs so that they couldn't hear the sound of their footsteps. We controlled every single variable the skeptics said might be the confounding factor, and we still got significant results. So there is clearly something that science does not recognize that allows people to, that allows animals to be able to recognize when their owners are coming home, and in a way that we just really don't understand. The other thing that I studied with Rupert was what we call the sense of being stared at, and many people report that they'll look at the back of someone and then the person will turn around, a stranger in the crowd, or they, for some uncanny reason, they feel like they need to turn around and they look around and got somebody staring right at them. It's a very common phenomenon. So we actually studied this as well. We blindfolded people, and we had people either stare or not stare at them and report how they, whether they thought they were being stared at or not, for a trial of 10 or 15 times, and then we would, calculate how many times they got right, and it was remarkable that the average person did better than chance. The average person did better than chance. And why was that? I mean, even if it's just a small effect, what was causing that small effect to do better than chance? So it seems like there were some people, of course, some subjects did way better than chance.
Wow.
And what was most interesting was there was one person who I personally tested who was under the influence of MDMA when he was being tested, and he did remarkably well.
Really?
Remarkably well. So there seems like there's psychic abilities that people have. And this was they haven't really been recognized by mainstream science yet. And this was the focus of my work with Rupert.
Two questions there. So it just kind of blows my mind when you bring this up. So you think the person that, or the person that did the MDMA did reasonably better than the people who weren't on it?
They did much better.
So the suggestion is that...
Also interesting, let me also mention, there was a research study done in Amsterdam years ago. I forget the type of psychic research it was. It was they used a gauze field. I don't know if you know what it is, with a blank thing, and they were, I think, being sent images, and they had to pick from 1 of 4, which was the images being sent, and they did. One group was under the influence of psilocybin, and one group wasn't. And the group under the influence of psilocybin did much, much better statistically. So, there really hasn't been. That's the only research study that I know of, and that wasn't even a formal research study. And this is just an area that's just crying out for research one day. You mentioned the wonderful work that MAPS and Beckley Foundation and great research into post-traumatic stress disorder with MDMA and for obsessive-compulsive disorder and end-of-life anxiety. There are going to be such really wonderful things that psychedelics can help with, and more power to that research. But I'm really looking forward to the day when it could be used to study creativity, psychic phenomena, parallel universes, and some of the more far-out things that people report.
Yeah, not just for sick and dying people, right, but for some of these other things as well. I hear what you're saying.
Yeah, well, not just for sick. Yeah, for everyone. I think it's really important for people who are sick and dying, but I think it has value for people who are healthy as well.
What I think is amazing, two things is, and I'm sure in the work that you've done, and like you said, having worked with and known, or at least known and interviewed John Lilly, you've this kind of thing before. That I'm sure you know Thomas Kuhn's book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, and this idea in the sciences that something's not true because it couldn't possibly be true, and so there's this sort of orthodoxy within the sciences of what's accepted as possible, and if something falls outside of that, then it's just simply, regardless of what the data says, it's just simply deemed not possible. And I think Rupert's work has fallen into this category a lot. People talk about his TED Talk and other things, but I think those books, which were wildly popular, and I read them both, I couldn't find anything wrong with the data, were just rejected, not because people thought could identify where you folks were doing bad science, but just simply because your results couldn't possibly be true.
Exactly, yeah, it did fit into the paradigm. And in Thomas Kuhn's book, he says that usually it takes a generation for one new paradigm to be accepted, because basically the older generation of scientists have to die out before the new generation, the new paradigm's accepted.
How lucky for you!
Younger scientists pick up on it much quicker.
Lucky for you. The other thing I want to ask you is the use of psychedelics in this. You have a chapter in in the New Science of Psychedelics that I really enjoyed. I enjoyed the whole book, but the psychobiology of gods and goddesses, and then you go into a discussion of the healing potential of psychedelics with mind-body medicine, and you talk about placebo and how, this is just this thing in school that we're taught as, okay, this is just some statistically sort of nuisance thing that gets in the way of us studying these new drugs. But then, all of this potential is there to study how the mind is actually involved and how perception is involved in healing the body. And I read a fascinating study a while back about prayer, and the study said that they took 3 groups of people. In one group, who were ill, they told that they were going to have churches pray for them, and then the churches did pray for them. The other group of people, they told they were going to have the churches pray for them, and then nothing happened. And then the other group of people, they didn't tell them anything, but they had the churches pray for them. And the people who did better in terms of healthcare outcomes were the 2 groups who were told they were being prayed for, whether they were or not, as long as they believed that they were.
So yes, isn't that interesting? Mm-hmm. I was very surprised. I spoke to Stan Grof, Stanislav Grof, the great psychiatrist, about this idea, and he's done more LSD research than anyone else. And I told him about my idea that I thought that the reason that psychedelics have ayahuasca specifically have such powerful potential to heal so many diverse different types of illness and traumas is because what they do is they amplify the mind's own ability, what we call the placebo effect. We know from scientific studies that the placebo effect means that the mind has the power to heal or harm the body.
Yeah.
Just through belief. And as you mentioned, it was so surprising to me when I was in school. This was always regarded as a nuisance. I mean, or something that got in the way of medical studies. You have to control for the placebo effect. That was like something that just got in the way. And I was scratching my head. Don't they realize how remarkable this is? This is the greatest discovery in medicine.
Yeah.
That we have something called the placebo effect. The mind can actually affect the health of the body. Isn't that remarkable? It actually affects the immune system. It truly affects it. I mean, that is really, really, really remarkable. That's big news. And what I think, people go down to Peru and Brazil and the Amazon, and they go down with all these different illnesses, and so many people claim that it was just healed overnight, from doing ayahuasca.
Wow.
And I think that is largely due to the power of the mind to heal the body, and that psychedelics, mainly what they do is they amplify the placebo effect by changing and modulating our sense of belief. What we believe to be real is modulated with a psychedelic experience. You start to believe things that maybe you didn't think were real, and now you start to entertain the possibility they might be real, and all those kind of possibilities open up in your mind that weren't there before. And I think that's the main reason that psychedelic drugs can be so profoundly healing for some people.
You think it enhances neuroplasticity?
I think it definitely does, yes, and neurogenesis as well.
Wow.
Yes.
Just a couple more questions before we let you go. What do you think about some of the work that's being done with microdosing?
Well, yeah, it's interesting. I wish there was some real work. There's some real research.
Yeah, there's just internet memes.
Right,
yeah.
There's a lot of people experimenting with it on their own, and I know people are sending reports into Jim Fadiman. But it is very, very interesting. It's really nothing new. Albert Hoffman talked about doing this, and when I was working with Oscar Janiger, the psychiatrist in LA who did the LSD creativity research, he told me that he sometimes actually years when LSD was legal, they used to use it, very, 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 very small doses of it, 10, 15, 20 milligrams as a kind of antidepressant. Just like it kind of functioned kind of like an antidepressant and a cognitive enhancer, kind of like a hydrogene or a smart drug. And he said that it was, for some people, it was very, very successful. And he said the only side effect was that sometimes people experienced what he called a touch of the strange. I never forget that word. A touch of the strange, which meant that things just seemed a little odd or strange, which, of course, a little bit of LSD would do.
On a regular basis, yeah.
But years ago when I did psychedelics, don't anymore. But years ago when I did experiment with microdoses, and I found it sometimes often more effective than doing larger doses if I was working on a creative project or wanted to get new ideas about something or a new perspective.
So if people, and again, we do the show, and I mean this more than just the obvious safety caveat. I mean, everything we're talking about is just for informational purposes. People have to make their own choices of what they do or do not, put into their body and what they experiment with. But if people have made that choice to experiment with these different things, whether it be ayahuasca or psilocybin or MDMA or any of the above, what kinds of things are available for them in terms of, models and maps to help them navigate the experience? What's there for them?
Well, first of all, if somebody has never had a psychedelic experience, I would recommend that they do it with someone who is trained and who's had experience. It's legal to go down to Peru and to work with a psychotherapist and shaman down there. One of my colleagues, Mariana Tikova, runs a psychotherapy / shamanic ceremonies down in the Amazon, and that's one way is to work with people who are already very experienced. I would highly suggest that people read as much about it as they possibly can. Knowledge is power. Knowledge is important, and psychedelics can be dangerous, can be produce a lot of unexpected experiences, and some of the best models that I've found for explaining and working with the experience came from Stanislav Grof. I really love his work. He wrote a book called LSD Psychotherapy. That's a classic in the field. I really like Timothy Leary and Robert Anton Wilson and Antero Ali. Their model of the eighth circuit brain, I think, is brilliant. Timothy Leary's book, Exopsychology, or the Infopsychology, it was republished as, or Robert Anton Wilson's Prometheus Rising, or Antero Ali's Angel Tech and the eighth circuit brain are all different explorations of this eighth circuit model, and I personally think that's probably one of the very best models for understanding the different states of consciousness that we experience right now, and a psychedelic experience as well. And I think it goes way beyond whatever Freud and Jung and all the traditional psychologists, when they built their models, it incorporates everything that they basically put together, and also incorporates all the higher states of psychedelic awareness as well.
You think sites like Arrowwood and others have decent information for people?
Oh, Arrowwood is a treasure chest. It's a godsend. Arrowwood has so much valuable information, and Earth and Fire Arrowwood are friends of mine. I think they're doing people who started the site. They're doing wonderful, wonderful work. And I would actually argue that as a public service, Arrowwood may have saved more lives than any other public service in human history.
Could you imagine having that when you and I were 15, 16 years old?
Yeah, I can only imagine.
Oh my God.
Kids today have access to so much valuable and accurate information. I mean, all we had were rare books that you had to order at bookstores if you knew about them. It was very, very hard, and the only way to meet other people in the psychedelic community was to go to psychedelic conferences. There was no active internet. The internet, by the way, was largely started by the psychedelic community. I was one of the first people back in the mid '80s when we were first getting emails before the web even came along, and they were just bullet boards, and it was largely like Grateful Dead heads, psychedelic enthusiasts.
No kidding.
And we were like, one day it's going to be mainstream. You'll see.
That's true. No kidding, huh? All in that same part of the country.
Yes, it's Northern California, right, exactly.
So where are we headed? I mean, you said, as we close up here, it's been great speaking with you, man, but, where do you hope this is all going in terms of psychedelics and culture, over the next 20 to 50 years in the United States and beyond? What do you hope to see?
What I would really like to see, I sort of touched on this earlier, but what I would really like to see is, a move away from, first of all, from we are starting the process of, not demonizing these substances, not ignoring and not ridiculing, as we've been doing for years in the mainstream media. We're starting to approach them now with more respect and intelligence, and and we're starting to study their potential for use in medicine and psychotherapy, and I think that's just absolutely wonderful. But what I'm really looking forward to is first of all, these things being able to be studied for creativity, then being able to be used for creativity. So the average person, if they want to have access to these things, that there could be either centers they can go to, or take a series of tests. I think these substances should be regulated in some way. I don't think they're for everyone, and I think that people should demonstrate that they have some type of mental, emotional, psychological stability before doing a psychedelic. I think that when they become legal in the future, they should be regulated. Something like getting a driver's license. That if you can prove that you're responsible and show responsible use, that you should be allowed the freedom to control your nervous system however you like. And so I'd like to see these things being used, for creativity, and then stepping into psychic phenomena, looking at studies and how they affect telepathy and psychokinesis and precognition, and then even more exciting, I'd love to see a continuation of the research that Rick Straussman was doing. Those people who don't know, Rick Straussman is a psychiatric researcher who was at the University of New Mexico, who for 5 years did a study where he was giving DMT, dimethyltryptamine, the most powerful psychedelic that we know of pretty much, that's also endogenous to the brain and found in many plants, and it's part of ayahuasca, giving it to subjects and different dosages, and just collecting reports. And consistently, these people would report going to parallel universes, parallel realities, meeting alien beings, extraterrestrials, being operated on in laboratories by these other beings. I mean, these experiences were so consistent that and I have personally experienced stuff like that when I did it years ago. I would love to see serious scientific work done in the future where they really explore this, where they give people Harmaline, which extends the DMT experience, where people can get it IV and be able to communicate and do it under systematic settings. I would love to see a real study of whether these experiences can lead to some type of study of an objective reality. Is there really an objective world that these people are going to? Are these other beings real? Do they have an independent existence separate from our own minds? I mean, that is a huge philosophical and scientific question that I would love to see addressed in future scientific studies.
Wow.
And
that's remarkable.
And also, like I said earlier, it's so important that we make psychedelics available to people, because we're such an ecologically blind species right now, and it's really the only thing that I know of that can turn someone around overnight and wake up their eyes and become more ecologically aware. So I do see all these things happening. I think it's inevitable, really.
What about something like forcing? I didn't mean to cut off your last statement there. You think it's inevitable? What?
That psychedelics will become legal. I think magic mushrooms will be next. First marijuana, then magic mushrooms.
What about things that and I was thinking of this just as you were talking there, and I was thinking of it sort of as a joke, as as trying to bring us to the end of the episode. But then as I was thinking it, I thought it's not so much a joke. People talk about a president all the time, and they say, I want a president that I can have a beer with. Right, as if that's some measuring stick on whether a candidate is trustworthy and whether or not you can relate to them and think that they're going to make good choices, somebody that you can consume alcohol with. And I wonder, how cool would it be if we could make our presidential candidates take psychedelics before a debate? Right, or at least or before an interview, right, and have them same thing, set and setting, with a trained professional there, but we're going to give Hillary and the Donald 7 grams of psilocybin, and then just turn the camera on and see what they talk about, right?
Yes, I agree. I think it was Larry Hagman, from My Dream Martini, who was a psychedelic proponent. I think he said that. I'm pretty sure it was him who said that it should be a requirement for world leaders before they step into their position to do ayahuasca or to do LSD.
No kidding.
He said that, and I think Graham Hancock, amended that by saying they should do it at least 10 times,
Yeah.
something like that. If I remember that right, I hope I'm getting that right.
They probably wouldn't have had the Brexit situation if they had.
Right, exactly.
Well, David, thank you so much for speaking with us, man. We're going to give folks, do you want to plug anything here at the end? I mean, we're going to give people access to your website and all the stuff you have going on. But
yeah, let me say, again, my new book is Dreaming Wide Awake, Lucid Dreaming, Shamanic Healing, and Psychedelics. It's right now probably the most comprehensive book about lucid dreaming, and it's also the first and only book that explores the interface between lucid dreaming and psychedelic shamanism. It was just published by Inner Traditions, and it is available on Amazon and any fine bookstore near you. So my website, www.mavericksofthemind.com, and find me on Facebook and friend me, and I'll be happy to stay in touch.
last question, why did lucid dreaming become such an important topic for you?
Lucid dreaming was important for me because it was involved in my personal healing. Psychedelics helped me heal from a trauma that I had as a child, and the lucid dreaming experiences were a very important factor in that. It was they would almost balance one another. What I experienced on the psychedelic experience and the ayahuasca experience, and what I experienced with lucid dreaming were symbiotic and absolutely that's the essential element in it. So
they stayed that way.
I explain, that connection, but it was very, very important. And I also think that anything you can experience with psychedelic, you can experience a lucid dream. So it's also a way of having psychedelic experiences without doing drugs or plants or anything illegal.
And a way for you to, again, explore those liminal spaces. And you found in your research that this was a common practice among various shamanic traditions, right? This bouncing back and forth between the two.
Yes, and all over the world, there's definitely a strong correlation between shamanism and lucid dreaming. In fact, sometimes it's hard to tell. A lot of anthropologists have difficulty distinguishing in reports what are trip reports and what are lucid dream reports.
Wow.
Sometimes. So.
No kidding.
Yep.
God, that's really fascinating. Hey, David, thanks so much for speaking with us, man.
Oh, it's been such a pleasure, Andy. Thanks so much for having me on.
You've been listening to On the Block Radio, folks. Our guest is David J. Brown. And get yourself over to the website to check out all of his work. It will blow your mind and change your perspective. All right, we're glad you joined us, and we will see you on the other side.
Hi, this is Zach Leary. I'm the host of the It's All Happening podcast, and you're listening to On the Block Radio.
So I first tried smoking DMT, dimethyltryptamine, in 1983 when I was 21 years old. I was at the home of a friend's house who offered to introduce me to it, and he scraped together a collection of these loose orange, red crystals from the bottom of a kitchen drawer, actually, and carefully placed them at the bottom of a huge glass pipe in his living room, where I sat down on a couch and watched him fire up this bowl from the bottom with this strong, it looked like a blowtorch almost that he was using. So he was vaporizing the DMT crystals, and I was inhaling them, and I took three deep lungfuls of this powerful plastic-tasting substance. It really tasted awful, horrible in my lungs, like molten glass scorching the inside of my chest. And but within seconds of the first lungful of this DMT, I felt like I was peaking higher than the highest LSD trip that I've ever been on, and absolutely insane kaleidoscopic patterns that were unfolding before me and were an order of magnitude more intense than anything I had previously witnessed on LSD, mescaline, or psilocybin. And, somehow I managed to inhale 2 more lungfuls of this god-awful tasting vapor, and a few seconds later, I found myself in a completely different, higher-ordered dimension, complex beyond anything I can adequately describe in the human language. So it was just impossible for me to gain my orientation during the experience, and I witnessed the most incredible things imaginable. This was definitely not a human world that I was in. It was populated by other intelligent creatures, and I was able to see an ever-morphing environment, their world in 360 degrees, and so much was going on around me. I watched in spellbound fascination as legions of small elf-like beings were diving in and out of this strange biological mechanism of some sort, and that was giving them some kind of enormous pleasure, it looked like. Years later, I realized that what they were actually doing was they were diving inside of a human body and experiencing a whole lifetime. And this was like an amusement park ride from the perspective of hyperspace. So, in any case, it just seemed like a brief moment for them to go through like an entire human lifetime. And suddenly I found myself in the grip of this intelligent being that was doing something to me that I just didn't understand. I kept trying to interpret what the being was and what was happening to me, and I felt utterly helpless. I was projecting every possible interpretation, millions of interpretations per second onto this being, and nothing would fit. Nothing seemed to make sense. I alternated between states of ecstatic pleasure and absolute terror as I wondered, is this being a scientist experimenting with me? Is he good? Is he bad? Is it a he or a she? Is it someone that I already knew somehow? Is he a friend, a lover, a parent, an angel, a demon? I mean, was this an extraterrestrial? Was it God communicating with me and experimenting with me? I mean, what was going on? I in some weird way, it seemed that this being was a giant version of myself, actually. Like it was like a gigantically huge and all-powerful David J. Brown that was like measuring and adjusting reactions in my brain with extreme precision as he administered a vast series of like intensifying stimuli that seemed to be activating all of my senses at once to their maximum threshold. Energies just poured into me, and it was beyond my capacity to handle as this being just adjusted the range of screaming sensations, twisting for what seemed like different colored light filters over me, asking me repeatedly with each click and each change, like this, like this, like this, like this. Then he was trying to determine what the intensity of the sensations were, and it was becoming too much for me. In one brain area or perceptual range after another, while I was desperately trying to understand what in the world was happening. So this towering being just seemed to be measuring and adjusting different threshold frequencies in my brain, and for experiencing pleasure and pain. And I vividly remember how these strong, sweet, and bitter, sometimes metallic taste sensations, strangely and synesthetically blended with continuously transforming extra-dimensional and extraterrestrial visual imagery as I pleaded with the being to please stop. I learned from the person that I was doing with that I actually said these words aloud. It was simply too much for my poor brain to handle, and much of what happened that afternoon, I have to say it's impossible to remember. But I started to become back to earth, and I don't know, it took me maybe forever just to remember that I was a human being who had smoked a drug. Though it felt like an eternity. I mean, it was only around 10 minutes that had actually gone by, and I was back in my body. And it wasn't long before I was asking my companion how long it had been, and wow, I was watching the vividly colorful tapestry patterns fluidly unfold, morph, and merge, ultimately solidifying into the walls and the furniture of my friend's apartment. And for around 10 minutes more, I felt like I was being shown secrets of how everything in our reality was being constructed behind the scenes, so to speak, much like a high dose of magic mushrooms. And and I was back to baseline in 30 minutes, and still to this day, that was the most powerful and mystifying psychedelic experience that I've ever had in my life.
You've been listening to On the Block Radio with Andrew Gurevich. The show is produced in Portland, Oregon by Michael DiNapoli at MD Productions. Theme music by Moving the Mountain. closing music by Jonathan Oak. Look us up on the web at ontheblockradio.com. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Don't forget to tune in next week for a brand new episode. Previous episodes can be found on our website. Thanks for listening.
Oh, you're beautiful kitty kitties. Oh, look at you out there. Beauty like a bolt, light in a darkened hallway. New minds, looking at this world, at our lives, with the perspective of apocalypse children. Standing dusty in the barren highways, standing broken before the fathers who were meant to make us whole, but who only lied to us about what it meant to be a man, about what it meant to be a woman, about what it meant to be a child